Richie Spice here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A White House bioethics commission has revealed gruesome new details about American-run venereal disease experiments on unsuspecting Guatemalans from 1946 to 48. The testing focused on sexually transmitted diseases and involved U.S. medical officials intentionally infecting Guatemalan sex workers, prisoners, soldiers, mental patients without their permission in order to study the effects of penicillin. The New York Times reports, quote, when some of the men failed to become infected through sex, the bacteria were poured into scrapes made on the penises or faces or even injected by spinal puncture. President Obama personally apologized to Guatemalan President Álvaro Colom for the experiments last year after they were discovered. Since then, the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues has studied 125,000 pages of documents and sent investigators to Guatemala. On Tuesday, the commission concluded nearly 5,500 people were subjected to diagnostic testing in Guatemala and more than 1,300 exposed to venereal disease or by contact or inoculation. President Álvaro Colom has described the experiments as a crime against humanity and ordered his own investigation. The Guatemala program was discovered by Wellesley College professor Susan Reverby while she was researching the infamous Tuskegee experiments. Professor Reverby spoke to Democracy Now! Last year and described how much U.S. officials knew about the practices the program's architect, Dr. John Cutler, was engaged in.
It's too easy to say, okay, this was a period when there wasn't research norms or any of the kind of regulations we've had in place since the mid-'70s. But Cutler's bosses at the Public Health Service knew this was sort of really on the edge. And the quote that I found that just really knocked me off the chair was one from the Surgeon General himself, who said, and this is secondhand, but it was in a letter to Cutler, where one of his colleagues said, the Surgeon General says, well, we couldn't do this in the United States. And that's just a stunning, absolutely stunning acknowledgement of what was going on.
That was Wellesley College professor Susan Reverby speaking last year on Democracy Now! Members of the Bioethics Commission investigating the venereal disease experiments say they recalled Nazi experiments on Jews. They argue that Dr. Cutler, who died in 2003, must have known from the Nuremberg doctors' trials underway by 1946 that his work was unethical. Panel members endorsed the idea of creating a compensation fund for subjects who are harmed in the future or requiring researchers to buy insurance for that purpose. Some countries require these steps. The United States does not. For more, we go to Philadelphia. We're joined by Dr. Anita Allen, a member of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She's a professor of law and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found and what you were most surprised by, Dr. Allen.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. We found many of the details of the experiments which had not been uncovered by Dr. Susan Reverby, whom you briefly quoted a few minutes ago. And we also found some of the explanations for why this heinous research was able to continue for so long.
Explain the scope of these experiments. What exactly happened?
Well, the original intent of the experiments was to determine whether or not there could be a prevention for the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases such as gonorrhea, syphilis, and chancroid. And this was a great question throughout the world. In a time of war, there's a great concern about the extent to which sexually transmitted diseases can affect troops. And so there was a great interest in finding a way to increase military readiness in the United States for our World War II efforts, but then generally to protect, as a public health matter, the population against unnecessary illness and even death caused by sexually transmitted diseases. So everyone agreed this was an important area of scientific medical research to pursue. But there was only so much you could do. It was deemed ethically impossible in the United States to, for example, deliberately infect adults with disease in order to treat them or to not treat them, to to track the course of the illness, but yet the doctors involved, Dr. Cutler of the United States Public Health Service and his colleagues, decided that they could do this offshore and took the experimental protocol to Guatemala, where, as you noted, more than 6,000 people were involved in this research.
And again, explain just who Dr. John Cutler was. He was a U.S. government employee working for the National Health Service, right?
Yes. So the time of the Guatemala experiments, which took place between 1944 and 1946, John Cutler was a 30-year-old scientist researcher who was employed by the United States Public Health Service. He was employed in their venereal disease research laboratory, which was headquartered in Staten Island, New York. And he and his colleagues had been working on STD research for many years. Cutler had been associated with Drs. Mahoney and Dr. Arnold in a U.S.-based project in a prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, where they had attempted to infect 241 U.S. prisoners with their consent, informed consent, in a similar research protocol. That research protocol failed miserably. They were unable to reliably create infection in U.S. prisoners. But they didn't give up. They really wanted to try to see if they could infect human subjects and to then attempt to see whether various prophylaxis medications would work to prevent the contraction of the disease or work to cure the disease.
The current issue of Harper's Magazine features excerpts of letters written by John Cutler, who oversaw the medical experiments in Guatemala. He was a surgeon, as you said, with the U.S. Public Health Service, to doctors at the Marine Hospital in Staten Island, New York. I want to read an excerpt of Cutler's letter dated January 7th, 1947. He writes, quote, "So far as the work in the prison goes, to increase the number of exposures, we shall bring in the source of infection along with some not infected, so as to allay fears and suspicion. In that way, we shall be able to avoid political repercussions." In another letter, Dr. Cutler characterizes his explanation of the experiments to the patients as, quote, double talk. Cutler was later involved with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which monitored the progression of the disease in African-American men who believed they were receiving health care from the U.S. government. This is a remarkable story here.
Yes, what the commission uncovered was that Dr. Cutler and his colleagues knew that they would not be able to get informed consent, believed that, in fact, if you went to Guatemala and you're working with prostitutes, mental patients, prisoners, soldiers, people who are ill, you don't have to get informed consent, and they didn't even attempt to get the informed consent. Instead, they attempted to conceal the exact nature of their work with the research subjects. As a result of that, there were many reluctant participants, or those who, for a pack of cigarettes or some other small amenity, were willing to undergo lumbar punctures, cisternal punctures to the base of the brain, or blood sticks. And this was not something which, again, could have ever been approved in the United States. It was absolutely outside the scope of what was legitimately considered ethical and humane conduct in the United States.
I wanted to bring our next guest into this discussion. She's in Washington, D.C. Her name is Piper Hendricks. She's an associate at Conrad & Scherer law firm there. She's helping to prepare a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government on behalf of 700 Guatemalans who were unknowingly affected with syphilis from 1946 to 1948 as part of this American medical experiment. She's collaborating with lawyers in Guatemala. Talk about who you represent. Piper Hendricks.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you. We represent an entire class of people who were impacted by the experiments. And that class includes everyone who was directly impacted, the soldiers, the mental patients, the prostitutes who were used, the orphans, and their family members. Something that's important to remember here is that the treatment of the people who were impacted was not a top priority. Some people were left untreated completely. Those who received treatment may not have received enough to actually cure them of the disease with which they were infected. And so they then passed that along to their spouses, to their children. And so this is much bigger than just those who were involved in the experiments, which, as you've already mentioned, is a very large number to begin with.
I wanted to turn for a minute to a clip of Dr. Cutler himself. This is a clip that comes from a documentary called Deadly Deception. It was done years ago by WGBH. Now here, Dr. Cutler is talking about the Tuskegee experiments that he went on to do in the United States after leaving Guatemala.
The Tuskegee study has been grossly misunderstood and misrepresented this way. And the fact was that it was concern for the black community trying to set the stage for the best public health approach possible and best therapy that led to the study being carried out. My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none. As a scientist, and say one would like to have seen an ideal scientific study, but we're dealing with human beings over a long period of time, and this is impossible.
That was Dr. Cutler. Before we go back to Piper Hendricks, Anita Allen, can you comment?
Well, it's a shame that many years later, Dr. Cutler experienced no remorse. As you know, he left his research notes from Guatemala in an archive to the University of Pittsburgh in 1990. So even in 1990, he did not understand, I think, that history would not forgive him and would not come to see that this scientifically invalid research, which violated human rights, was not somehow worthwhile. So we have again, a tragic example of someone who engaged in horrendous research in at least two contexts and felt no remorse about it.
We're going to go to break, and then we're going to come back to this discussion. Dr. Anita Allen is a member of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethics, about the bioethical issues. Piper Hendricks is with the law firm Conrad & Schuer, representing Guatemalan families who were affected by the U.S. experiments in Guatemala in the 1940s. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.